A millionaire CEO saw a little girl sitting alone outside a grocery store. When she spoke, his entire world shifted in one sentence. Caden Carmichael had spent most of his life in motion. The kind of motion that filled calendars, boardrooms, and airports. As CEO of one of the most successful tech investment firms on the East Coast, his days were structured down to the minute. Nothing ever surprised him anymore, and frankly, nothing moved him either. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Boston, he made an unplanned stop at a small neighborhood grocery store. He had skipped lunch again, and his assistant had canceled dinner reservations after a last-minute meeting ran long. It was supposed to be a quick in-and-out visit, something forgettable. But the moment he stepped out of his sleek black car and turned toward the store entrance, everything changed. There, sitting on the curb just to the side of the automatic doors, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, bundled in a light, slightly dirty pink jacket, with messy blonde hair falling into her wide, unmistakably blue eyes. Eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. She held a plastic bowl in her lap, empty, clean, and cradled with both hands like it was the most valuable thing she owned. Her shoes were worn, her expression quiet, and her posture still but alert, like she had been sitting there for a while, unsure what to do next. Caden stopped walking. At first, he thought maybe she was waiting for someone. Maybe her mother was inside, or maybe she had wandered over from a nearby building. But there was no adult in sight. People passed her without looking down, each wrapped in their own urgency. The sight struck him harder than he expected. Something about the way she sat, patient but tired, brave but small, hid a place in him that had been closed off for years. He crouched down, careful not to alarm her. "Hey there," he said gently, keeping his voice low. "Are you okay? Is someone with you?" The girl looked up slowly. Her voice was soft and steady. "My mom is sick. I just wanted to get her some food." Caden blinked. "Where's your dad?" She shrugged, then said plainly, "I don't have one. It's just me and mommy." There was no fear in her voice, just truth. It wasn't a dramatic plea or manipulation. She wasn't begging, she was simply explaining. Caden felt his heart tighten. He hadn't felt something like that in a long time. Without thinking, he stood and said, "Wait right here, okay? I'll be back in just a minute." He walked into the store with his chest aching in a way he couldn't explain. He picked up a bag and started filling it, soup, bread, fruit, juice boxes, a few things that could last. He didn't care what it cost. When he came back outside, she was still sitting exactly where he'd left her. He knelt again and handed her the bag. "Here. For you and your mom." The girl's eyes lit up, not with excitement, but with quiet relief. She held the bag close to her chest and looked up at him with a strange sort of trust that didn't belong to a child who had been treated kindly often. Then she said something that froze him in place. "You look like me." Caden's breath caught. He hadn't noticed before, not in detail. But now that she said it, he did. The same pale hair. The same striking blue eyes. The same nose, even. He stared at her, stunned. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma." He tried to swallow the lump in his throat. "Emma, can you take me to your mom?" She nodded without hesitation. "She's not far. We live close." He stood and offered her his hand. She took it, small fingers wrapping around his without fear. As they walked away from the store, toward wherever home was for her, Caden felt the ground shift under him. Something deep in his chest told him this wasn't random. That this wasn't going to be just another one-off moment. He didn't know what he was about to find, but he knew that everything in his life was about to change. Emma led him through a quiet neighborhood a few blocks from the store. The streets were narrow, lined with old brick buildings and overgrown trees that cast long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. Caden held the grocery bag in one hand and Emma's small fingers in the other, though he was careful not to grip too tightly. She walked with the calm confidence of someone who had done this route many times before, despite her young age. There was no skipping, no chatter, just the steady sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustle of wind moving through the trees. Caden didn't ask any questions as they walked. He didn't want to overwhelm her. Instead, he watched her out of the corner of his eye, quietly studying her small face, her thoughtful expressions, and the way she glanced up at him every few minutes, as if to make sure he was still there. They turned down a side alley and stopped in front of an aging duplex. The front steps were worn and slightly tilted, the paint on the door chipped away by time and weather. Emma let go of his hand and bounded up the steps without knocking. She opened the door and turned to look back at him. "You can come in. Mommy doesn't get up much anymore." He hesitated for only a second before following her inside. The apartment smelled faintly of medicine and stale air, but it was clean. Worn, yes, but tidy. There were children's drawings taped to the walls, a few small toys in the corner, and a thin curtain drawn across a cracked window to keep out the late sun. In the small living room, lying on an old couch, was a woman. Her hair, once golden, had dulled to a tired shade of blonde. Her face was pale, her body wrapped in a blanket, and her eyes, those same blue eyes, fluttered open at the sound of the door. "Emma," the woman whispered, her voice dry and thin. "I brought food," Emma said proudly, holding up the bag as if it were treasure. "And, a man helped me. He's nice." Caden stepped fully into the room, and the moment the woman saw him, her body jolted ever so slightly. Her mouth parted in disbelief, and for a long second, she couldn't speak. He froze, heart thudding in his chest, because he recognized her instantly. "Laura." She tried to sit up, but her body protested. "Caden." Her voice was full of shock, pain, and something deeper, grief, maybe. He dropped the bag on the nearby table and stepped closer. He hadn't seen her in 6 years. Not since the night they'd ended things with words too sharp to take back. They hadn't spoken since. She looked different, older, thinner, paler, but she was still her. "I didn't know," he said quietly, unsure what else he could say. Emma stood beside her mother, looking between them with wide eyes. "You know my mommy?" Caden nodded, eyes never leaving Laura's. "Yes. I did. I do." Laura looked away, her eyes filling with tears she didn't bother hiding. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." He sat in the nearest chair, stunned by everything, her appearance, the child who looked like him, the unspoken questions that filled the room like smoke. "Is she?" Laura didn't answer at first. She pulled Emma close, stroking her hair, grounding herself in the moment. Finally, she nodded. "Yes. She's yours." The air left his lungs. He'd always thought he would never be a father. Their breakup had been final, brutal. She had left without telling him she was pregnant, and he'd never known, never imagined. He looked at Emma again, and now it all made sense. The resemblance. The calm strength. The eyes. He turned back to Laura. "Why didn't you tell me?" Laura swallowed hard, then said with quiet difficulty, "Because I was angry. Because I didn't want anything from you. Because I thought I could do it alone. And then I got sick, and I couldn't fix it." There was no blame in her tone. Only exhaustion and regret. Caden leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, trying to process it all. The child he had never met. The woman he had loved and lost. And now, the chance, however fragile, to step into something he never even knew he wanted. "I want to help," he said finally. Laura looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said firmly. "Not just because I should. Because I can't walk away now. Not from her. Not from you." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was full of history, of questions they'd have to face later. But beneath it was something neither of them had felt in a long time. A beginning. One they hadn't expected, but one they both needed. The hours after that conversation passed in a kind of quiet haze. Laura rested on the couch, her body too weak to stay upright for long, and Emma had curled up beside her, still holding the grocery bag like it was a prized possession. Caden sat nearby, staring out the window into the fading light, trying to reconcile everything he had just learned with the life he thought he knew. He had always believed he was in control of his story, that every decision led logically to the next, that success would fill the empty places left behind by loss. But now, sitting in a modest apartment with a woman he once loved and a daughter he didn't know existed, he felt every part of his old life begin to shift. He kept glancing at Emma, watching the way she reached for Laura's hand, the way her small fingers traced the curve of her mother's wrist like it was a bedtime routine. There was love there, pure, quiet, and fierce. It was the kind of love Caden hadn't known he was missing. He had watched people from a distance for years, convincing himself that connections were distractions, that family was something best delayed or avoided for the sake of focus. But now, watching Emma stroke Laura's hand with sleepy eyes and complete trust, he realized that focus had cost him something far more permanent than time. As Laura began to drift into sleep, Caden stood and gently took the grocery bag from Emma's lap. She looked up at him with tired curiosity. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" she whispered, the question like a pin to his chest. He crouched beside her and spoke quietly. "We're going to make sure she gets better. I promise." She didn't ask how. She simply nodded, as if his presence was enough to believe in. He walked into the small kitchen and began unpacking the groceries, trying to find some order in the simple task. The cupboards were nearly bare. A few cans, some crackers, and not much else. The fridge was even more bleak, half a bottle of juice, a few eggs, some leftover rice in a container. He felt something harden inside him. This was his daughter. His child had been living like this while he'd been dining in penthouses and flying first class across the world. He spent the next hour quietly cleaning the kitchen. He found dish soap under the sink and washed every plate, wiped the counters, tossed out expired food. He moved like a man trying to apologize with every gesture, every motion. When he finished, he returned to the living room to find Emma asleep on Laura's chest, both of them breathing softly in sync. He stood over them for a long moment, overwhelmed. He didn't want to leave, but he also didn't want to intrude. Still, something inside him said he couldn't just walk out and return to normal. There was no more normal. Not after this. He left a note on the small table, "I'll be back in the morning. Whatever you need, I'm here. See." Then he slipped out into the cool night air, but instead of heading home, he drove back to the store and filled 2 more bags, this time with medicine, soup, vitamins, essentials. When he returned, he quietly left them by the door. That night, back in his luxury apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and imported furniture, he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, staring out over the city, unable to stop seeing Laura's pale face and Emma's eyes that matched his own. The truth was now inescapable: he had a daughter. She had his name, his blood, and she had already suffered more than he ever had. And Laura, who had raised her alone while fighting an illness, had done so without bitterness or help. That realization wasn't just humbling. It was life-changing. He didn't know what the next day would bring. He didn't know if Laura would forgive him, or if Emma would accept him as more than the man who brought food. But he knew this: he wasn't going to disappear again. For the first time in his carefully controlled, perfectly scheduled life, Caden Carmichael didn't have a plan. But he had a reason. And that was enough. The next morning arrived gray and quiet, the kind of day that carried a weight of its own. Caden woke before the sun rose, having never really fallen asleep. He spent hours pacing his apartment, stopping only to look at the empty bed, the untouched kitchen counter, the framed accolades on his walls that now felt irrelevant. All of them reminders of the life he had built, alone, efficiently, successfully. But none of those things could explain why a 5-year-old girl had to sit outside a grocery store just to find food. He dressed quickly in jeans and a plain shirt, discarding his usual pressed suit and cufflinks, and filled his car with more supplies, fresh groceries, warm clothes in different sizes, a few small toys, and a new set of bedding. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to fix what he could. When he knocked gently on Laura's door just after 8, there was no answer at first. He waited a moment before knocking again. The door creaked open slowly, and Emma peeked out, still in her pajamas, holding a small stuffed animal under one arm. Her hair was messy, and her eyes were sleepy, but when she saw him, she smiled. Not wide, but like she'd been expecting him. She stepped back and let him in without a word. Laura was awake but still lying on the couch, wrapped in the same blanket. She looked better in the light, but she was still pale, still fragile. Her voice was quiet when she greeted him, unsure but not cold. "You came back," she said, her eyes on the bags in his hands. "I told you I would," Caden replied, setting them down near the kitchen. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted to make sure you had what you needed." She tried to sit up but winced slightly. He was by her side in an instant, not touching, just there. "I'm okay," she said softly. "Just tired." He didn't ask again. Instead, he gently took the blanket and adjusted it around her shoulders. Emma had climbed onto the arm of the couch and was now curled beside her mother, playing with the edge of the fabric. There was a silence between the three of them that wasn't uncomfortable. It was something new. Familiar and unfamiliar all at once. Caden spent the rest of the morning helping around the apartment. He fixed the loose kitchen cabinet door. He cleaned the bathroom without being asked. He set up a small table for Emma to draw on near the window. Laura watched him quietly. There was hesitation in her expression, like she didn't quite know how to receive this version of him. The Caden she remembered had been driven, confident, emotionally distant when it mattered most. The man in her living room now was different. Gentler. More present. Real. Later, as Emma napped in her room and the apartment was quiet again, Laura finally spoke without filter. "You know, I didn't keep her from you out of hate." She was looking down, hands in her lap. "I was scared. I was angry. But mostly, I didn't know how to ask for help. And by the time I wanted to, it felt too late." Caden didn't interrupt. He let the words come, even if they hurt. "You were right to be angry," he said after a long pause. "I wasn't the kind of man you could rely on back then. I made work my world. And when I lost you, I buried everything else just to keep moving." Laura looked up at him then, her expression softer than before. "But she's here. And she's yours." He nodded slowly, his voice lower. "I want to be her father. If you'll let me." "I don't want her to be disappointed," Laura said. "She's already had to grow up too fast." "I won't walk away," he promised. "Not this time. Not ever." They didn't make any formal decisions that day. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand gestures. Just small things, a bowl of soup shared between them, Emma waking up and climbing onto Caden's lap like it was natural, Laura allowing herself to rest a little longer without guilt. And maybe that was what healing actually looked like. Not instant forgiveness. Not forgetting the past. But slowly, quietly, starting to build something again, on trust, on effort, on presence. That evening, as Caden left for the night, Laura stood at the door. "Will you come again tomorrow?" He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that felt like home. "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow, and the day after that. For as long as you'll have me." The following days unfolded in a slow, steady rhythm that none of them had expected, but all of them needed. Each morning, Caden showed up at Laura's apartment just after sunrise, often with a fresh bag of groceries or something small for Emma, nothing extravagant, just thoughtful little things. A coloring book. A pair of warm socks. A second-hand children's story he remembered his own mother reading to him once. He never made a big deal out of it. He brought these things as naturally as someone bringing flowers to a hospital room, not out of pity but out of quiet affection and a deepening sense of responsibility. Laura was still cautious, but the lines on her face began to soften. She'd started to let him help more, showing him where she kept the mail, letting him schedule a doctor's appointment, even allowing him to help her into a cab when she needed a follow-up test at the clinic. She was stubborn about her independence, but she was also too exhausted to keep fighting everything on her own. And Caden never pushed. He stayed in his lane, showing up with consistency, not demands. Emma became his shadow. In the afternoons, she would sit with him at the small table near the window while he helped her draw or build things out of blocks. Her favorite activity became making pretend menus for restaurants she opened with stuffed animals as customers. She named one restaurant after him, Caden's Cafe, where she insisted he be the chef and taste tester. He'd never smiled so much in his life, and it wasn't the fake corporate grin he'd mastered years ago. It was something different. Something deeper. Something real. At night, after Emma had gone to bed and the apartment was wrapped in a gentle hush, Caden and Laura often sat together in the living room, not as ex-lovers navigating a minefield of memories, but as two people slowly rebuilding something they had both assumed was broken beyond repair. Some nights they talked, mostly about Emma or small things, weather, music, memories from their early 20s when things still felt possible. Other nights they sat in silence, but it was the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. It simply existed, safe and shared. One evening, a week after that first encounter at the grocery store, Laura handed Caden an envelope. Inside was a photograph. It was worn around the edges and slightly faded, but unmistakable. It was Emma as a baby, barely a few days old, sleeping against Laura's chest in a hospital bed. Caden stared at it for a long time, his fingers trembling just slightly. "I wanted to send it to you," Laura said, voice quiet. "So many times. But I didn't know what you'd do with it. I didn't think you'd want it." He looked at her then, his eyes stinging. "I would have framed it." They both laughed gently, but it was laced with something heavier, something that had been waiting to be let out for too long. Laura reached over and touched his hand. He turned his palm upward and laced his fingers with hers, and they sat that way, holding on to something unspoken but undeniable. Later that night, as he prepared to leave, Laura walked him to the door, something she hadn't done before. "Thank you," she said, and she wasn't just talking about the groceries or the appointments or the toys. She was talking about staying. About choosing not to run. About choosing them. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. When the door closed behind him, he didn't feel the usual ache that came from leaving something important behind. Instead, he felt something else, hope. Tentative, cautious, but alive. For the first time in years, he wasn't measuring his life in deals closed or meetings booked. He was measuring it in bedtime stories, quiet talks, shared meals, and the feeling of a little girl running into his arms without hesitation. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he was finally becoming the man he was always meant to be. By the second week, the rhythm they had begun to build no longer felt temporary. It felt natural, almost like muscle memory returning after long disuse. The apartment, once silent and still most days, was beginning to hum with quiet energy. Emma now woke up each morning asking if Caden would be coming, and Laura no longer hesitated before answering yes. His presence had become a constant, but not in a way that overstepped. He respected boundaries, never asked for more than he was given, but made it clear every day that he wasn't leaving. Still, as things settled into something close to peace, the world outside their small unit began to creep in. It started with a neighbor, an older woman who had lived upstairs for decades. She saw Caden leaving one morning and made a comment in the hallway, something casual but sharp: "Big car, big wallet, easy fix." Laura heard about it later from the building manager, and although it shouldn't have mattered, it did. Whispers turned into questions, and the tension that Laura had worked so hard to quiet in herself started to rise again. She had lived her life for 5 years avoiding judgment, surviving with minimal help, resisting the image of a woman who needed saving. Now, with Caden's return, it looked to some like she had waited for her old flame to swoop in and solve everything. Caden noticed the shift almost immediately. Laura began insisting on doing things alone again, even when her body clearly needed rest. She avoided his eyes when accepting his help and sometimes disappeared into the bedroom when he arrived. One afternoon, when he offered to pay for a round of medication that wasn't covered by her insurance, she snapped, not loudly, not cruelly, but with frustration that had been building. "I can't be your project," she said, standing at the kitchen sink with her back to him. "I know you mean well, but I can't let you fix this like one of your companies. I need to do this my way." Caden took a step forward, then paused. He could have argued. He could have told her he was just trying to help, that he wasn't trying to control anything, that he respected her independence. But he realized that none of that would matter if she didn't feel seen. So instead of defending himself, he simply said, "Okay. Tell me what you need. I'll follow your lead." She turned around slowly, her expression softening. "I just need you to be here. Not to make it all disappear. Just to be in it with me." "I can do that," he said. That conversation changed something between them. It stripped away the last layer of formality and turned their fragile truce into real partnership. From that point on, Caden stopped trying to fill every gap. He started asking more questions. He let Laura set the pace, when she needed space, when she wanted company, when she needed silence. And in return, Laura began opening up more. She told him about the early days with Emma, the night spent crying into a baby blanket when she didn't know how she'd get through another week. She told him how she'd found strength in small routines, singing lullabies even when she was sick, drawing stars on the ceiling to distract Emma when they didn't have heat, finding laughter in nonsense. He told her about the hollow years, about building an empire that left him with nothing to come home to. About nights staring at spreadsheets in penthouse silence, wondering what he had traded away for the illusion of success. They met in those stories, not as strangers finding each other again, but as people uncovering the truth of who they had become. Emma, sensing the shift, blossomed. She started calling him Dad without anyone asking her to. One night, after dinner, she handed him a crayon drawing. It was a simple picture, 3 figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, a house with smoke curling from the chimney, and a little heart floating above it. Caden stared at it longer than he should have, overwhelmed by what that tiny piece of paper meant. Laura watched him quietly and said, "She sees what you are. Even before you do." Caden didn't reply. He just reached for the magnet on the fridge and placed the drawing where he could see it every time he walked into the kitchen. That evening, as they all sat on the couch watching an old animated movie, Emma asleep between them with her head on Caden's leg, Laura reached over and gently took his hand. There were no words, no promises. Just her fingers wrapping around his. And in that moment, Caden realized he didn't need any more signs or signals. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The arrival of spring was quiet but certain, marked by longer days and the soft rustle of fresh leaves outside Laura's apartment windows. With the changing season came a shift in atmosphere inside the home as well. There was still struggle, Laura's health hadn't fully recovered, and financial pressure never truly disappeared, but the weight of those things began to feel less suffocating. Caden's presence was no longer a surprise, no longer something to be adjusted to. He had become part of the daily rhythm. He was there in the mornings helping Emma with her shoes, there in the afternoons picking up groceries or folding laundry, and there in the evenings reading bedtime stories with a calmness that Emma had quickly come to associate with safety. Laura was no longer just surviving. Though her body still needed rest, her spirit was returning in fragments. She began baking again, something she hadn't done in years, and Caden watched with fascination as her hands, thin but capable, moved through flour and dough with the muscle memory of old comfort. Emma often helped, perching on a stool, dusted in flour and grinning as she clumsily stirred batter or licked frosting off a wooden spoon. These small moments began to build something Caden hadn't expected: permanence. And with that realization came a quiet anxiety that he hadn't wanted to admit to himself. For all the warmth growing between them, he still carried the fear that it could all be taken from him. He had seen success collapse overnight in business. What if this fragile new life was just as fragile? One afternoon, while Laura rested and Emma was out at a neighbor's birthday party, Caden sat alone on the back steps of the apartment building, turning her drawing over in his hand. The one with the three of them beneath a sun and a heart. He heard the door open behind him and turned to find Laura standing there, wearing a cardigan and the faintest trace of a smile. She sat beside him without a word. For a while, neither of them spoke. The breeze brushed across them, and Caden felt the weight of something unsaid pressing down on his chest. "I've been thinking," he finally said. "About the future. About what happens when this isn't an emergency anymore." Laura looked down at her hands, folding and unfolding them. "I've been thinking about it too. I want to stay," he said, and his voice held none of the doubt he'd been carrying alone. "Not just visit or help or patch things together. I want to build something with you. For real this time. If you'll have me." She didn't look at him right away. Her eyes were on the trees, their branches trembling just slightly in the breeze. When she finally turned to him, there was both fear and warmth in her expression. "It's not that I don't want that," she said. "It's that I don't know how to let myself want it without waiting for it to fall apart." Caden nodded. He understood. They had both lived through things that left marks. "Then let's not rush it. Let's take one day at a time. But I want you to know this isn't just a phase for me. You're not a detour. You're home." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until Emma came bounding up the alleyway, arms full of candy and party favors, shouting for both of them to come inside and see the face painting she had half smeared across her cheek. That night, after Emma was asleep and the house had fallen into the quiet that only comes when a child is truly at peace, Laura and Caden found themselves once again in the living room. She reached for his hand across the cushions and said, softly but with clarity, "I want this too. I want you. But I want us to build it slow, steady. I've had enough of rushing through life and holding my breath." Caden squeezed her hand gently, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Slow works. I'm not going anywhere." And they sat there, fingers intertwined, a little girl sleeping down the hall, and a whole life unfolding in silence between them. It wasn't perfect. But it was honest. And that made it real. Summer arrived with a quiet warmth that didn't just touch the skin but seemed to settle into the bones of everyone in the neighborhood. The trees outside Laura's apartment bloomed fully, casting soft shadows through the windows in the late afternoon. The apartment, once dim and silent, now echoed with the sounds of life, laughter, dishes clinking, light music, and the occasional sound of Emma singing to herself as she played in the living room. It was the kind of peace that didn't come suddenly but was slowly, patiently built over time. For the first time in a long time, Laura felt like she wasn't surviving, she was living. Caden had quietly moved into a small apartment just a few blocks away. He didn't want to impose on Laura's space too quickly, and she appreciated that. It gave them both breathing room while still keeping him close. Every morning, he walked over with coffee in one hand and a fresh apple for Emma in the other. He had found joy in the simplicity of routines, making breakfast, folding laundry, and helping Emma with her reading. He had no board meetings to rush to, no international calls disrupting dinner. He had stepped back from the firm entirely, letting his partners take over, choosing instead to build something more meaningful from the pieces of the life he'd nearly missed. Laura's health had improved significantly. With proper medication, regular checkups, and the stress of constant uncertainty no longer hanging over her like a cloud, she had begun to look like herself again, or maybe, like the version of herself that had been waiting all along to come forward. Her energy returned in small bursts, then longer stretches. She began to work part-time from home, designing layouts for a local magazine that had always admired her eye for detail. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her purpose, and more importantly, the sense that she was still her own person, strong, capable, and full of ideas. Emma continued to thrive. With both of her parents now present in her life, she seemed to grow into herself more each day. Her favorite part of the week became Sunday afternoons, when the three of them would visit the city park with a picnic blanket and a small cooler filled with homemade sandwiches and lemonade. Emma would run to the swings, and Laura and Caden would sit close by, watching her fly forward and back, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, her laughter ringing out into the sky like a promise. But even in all the light, there were shadows. Healing didn't erase the past, it simply made space for it. Some evenings, Laura would wake up from old memories and sit by the window for a long time before coming back to bed. Sometimes, Caden would look at Emma and feel an ache for the years he had missed, birthdays he hadn't attended, first steps he never saw. They didn't talk about these things every day, but they didn't hide from them either. And that honesty became part of their strength. One Saturday in July, they planned a small get-together in the community garden behind the building. Caden grilled vegetables while Laura arranged a mismatched set of plates on a picnic table, and Emma helped by handing out cups of lemonade to the guests. A few neighbors came, some curious, others genuinely happy to see the family that had once seemed broken now whole again. There was music playing from someone's portable speaker, and laughter echoed across the courtyard. Emma, in a sun hat far too big for her head, stood on a milk crate and declared that her family made the best lemonade in the world. Everyone clapped. Later that evening, when the guests had left and the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Caden and Laura sat on the porch steps, watching Emma chase fireflies in the grass. He looked over at her and said, "I don't think I've ever loved anything more than this." Laura smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's not perfect. But it's ours." And it was. Imperfect, unexpected, stitched together with second chances and built on the quiet bravery of showing up, every day, even when it was hard. Caden had learned what it meant to be a father not through lectures or books, but by listening, apologizing, and staying present. Laura had relearned trust not because she had to, but because she saw him earn it one moment at a time. And Emma, their bright, wild-hearted daughter, had given them both the chance to become who they were always meant to be. As the stars appeared and the streetlights blinked on one by one, Emma ran up to them, her cheeks flushed with joy. "Can we do this again tomorrow?" she asked. Caden looked at Laura, who was already smiling, and then back at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "Tomorrow sounds perfect." And so, with no dramatic declarations or perfect endings, they simply kept going, together. Building a life, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time.